Hello all, and welcome to our post-election analysis debrief. I'm so glad to have you all join us this morning. We have two really great panelists who are joining us today to give their perspectives. And we're just going to get started. A couple of ground rules. So if you can make sure to keep your Zoom muted, that would be great. We heartily encourage you to use the chat box. So if as we're going along, you have questions, drop those in there. We're going to have a nice hearty question and answer section at the end to use for that. But in order to make sure that you don't lose your train of thought, just pop it in there and we'll make sure to lift it up at the end. So without further ado, I am really delighted to welcome our two panelists today. Peter Gordon, who is Director of Federal Affairs for Americans for the Arts. Peter joined Americans for the Arts in January of 2019. Prior to joining Americans for the Arts, Peter served as the Associate Director of Government Relations for the Council on Foundations, where he focused on tax policy and advocated on behalf of foundations on Capitol Hill. Before joining the council, he was the government relations specialist for the National Association of College Stores in Washington, D.C. Previously, Peter worked on Capitol Hill in both the Senate as a staff assistant to former Senator Roland Burris of Illinois, and in the House as a legislative assistant for our very own Representative Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts. And Peter grew up in Massachusetts, so we're glad to have one of our own down in DC working with Americans for the Arts, and holds a master's in public policy degree from George Washington and a BA in history and political science from Williams College. During college, he worked at the 62 Center for Theater and Dance at Williams, where he developed a deep appreciation for the arts. And Peter loves to visit museums and attend theater performances. He lives in DC with his wife, Corey, their daughter, Alex, and their son, Taylor. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us. And we also have Matt Irish, Vice Chairman of O'Neill and Associates. Matthew Irish is the Vice Chairman of O'Neill and Associates and manager of the firm's government relations practice. But drawing upon his close to 25 years of experience with the Massachusetts State Legislature and on numerous political campaigns, Matt develops and implements public affairs strategies that helps clients reach their goals on the municipal and state levels. Matt provides advice and counsel related to the growth and strategy of the company and the large-scale business development initiatives. Prior to joining O'Neill and Associates, Matt served as the Chief of Staff for Massachusetts State Senator Stephen Tolman. In his role, he oversaw and directed all legislative, budgetary, personnel, and administrative issues and acted as the media spokesperson. Before becoming Chief of Staff, Matt served as Senator Tolman's senior legislative aide and staff director. He began his career as a press assistant for the then U.S. Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle. Matt graduated from UMass Amherst with a bachelor's degree in political science. He spent his junior year studying abroad at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, and he holds two graduate degrees, a master's degree in modern Irish history from Boston College, as well as a master's degree in public affairs from the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Public Policy Studies at UMass Boston. Matt is a native and resident of Worcester, Mass., a graduate of St. John's High School. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the National Association of State Lobbyists and as the Vice President of the Board of Trustees of the Worcester Public Library Foundation. Welcome, Matt. I'm really glad to have you here as well. So today we're going to try to rocket through a lot of information and then move to more of a conversation. So first, let's start out with some of the federal election results. And Peter's going to sort of help us go through this a little bit. So first, we have the presidential election, which the source we're using over here at MASSCreative is the New York Times. So they called it for Joe Biden on Saturday, November 7th, which also happens to be my birthday. So it was a delightful birthday for me and for the country. Excuse me, Peter, is there anything of note to talk about in terms of the presidential election?
Yeah, and happy belated birthday. So as you noted, most news organizations have called it for the Biden-Harris ticket, so President-elect Biden.
Great. Awesome.
President Trump has not conceded yet and is pursuing several different legal avenues to try and find enough votes that would overturn some of these states that are pretty close. It is completely normal that counts will happen after election day. It happens every election. Lots of states don't certify their elections for several weeks. And so that's still something to watch, but even if President Trump were successful in all of his legal challenges, which he likely won't be, many of them have already been dismissed, he likely would not be able to find enough votes to overtake President-elect Biden. And so that's all I'll say about the presidential.
Gotcha. All right, so then moving on to the Senate, it, according to the New York Times again, it is a tie with 4 remaining seats, and there's a runoff for 2 seats in Georgia. Is that correct, Peter?
Yes, that's correct. So there are the 4 seats that are still outstanding are North Carolina, which Senator Tillis, who's the incumbent, has a pretty healthy lead and does not look like it's going to be overtaken by Cal Cunningham, I believe is the candidate there. In Alaska, Dan Sullivan's the incumbent, and I want to say Al Gross is the challenger who's running as an independent. Alaska's a little bit weird in that a lot of votes are still left to be counted. Everybody kind of assumes that Dan Sullivan will have enough to retain his position, but that is something that's still out there. And then in Georgia, both Senate seats were up due to a special election and retirement. And those in Georgia, if one candidate does not get over 50% of the vote, then it automatically goes to a runoff on January 5th. So there will be 2 runoffs on January 5th that likely will determine what the balance of power in the Senate is, assuming that Republicans win both the North Carolina and the Alaska seats. That means that Democrats would have to win both runoffs. And once President-elect Biden is sworn in, Vice President-elect Harris would be the tie-breaking vote, so they would have a majority. Otherwise, it'll be a very slim majority for Republicans, much slimmer than they've had before.
And we'll talk about what that majority, slim majority means in just a second. And then moving on to, that says Senate election results, it should say House election results, but it looks like the Democrats are close to holding on to control for the US House. Anything of note there, Peter?
Yeah, so hopefully you guys can all hear me now. So the Democrats are projected to retain a majority in the House. It will be a slimmer majority than they have had in the past. There are just some interesting things. There were a lot of instances where polls were projecting that Dems would actually win seats in the expand their majority, but they have not. So there's a lot of talk around some of the polling being bad. But you do have to remember that this was a presidential election with an incumbent. So that generally would lead to more Republican seats being won. So there are currently 21 seats remaining. A lot of those are in New York and California, where they're just having to take more time to process those ballots, and a lot of them are close. And so the seats that the Democrats have lost so far have mostly been in districts that Trump won pretty handily in 2016, but Dems were able to flip in 2018. So we're looking at a slimmer majority for Speaker Pelosi, who has said that she'll run again for Speaker. But again, with the House, all you need is 218 votes to pass anything you want. And the Speaker has proven very adept in being able to keep her caucus in line when she needs to. So it looks like the Democrats will retain that majority.
Great, thanks, Peter. And then just taking a look at what the elections were in Massachusetts regarding our congressional delegation. So Both of our senators, both Senator Markey and Warren, won re-election and will be continue to be, well, excuse me, Warren wasn't up for re-election, but they're incumbents and they'll keep their seats. In the House of Representatives, the only new member of Congress will be Congressman-elect Jake Auchincloss, who is taking over District 4, which was Joe Kennedy III's seat before he decided to run for Senate instead. I also just mentioned here folks who are currently holding chairmanships that are in our congressional delegation. So Congressman Richard Neal is chair of Ways and Means. Congressman James McGovern is chair of Rules. Congressman Stephen Lynch is the chair of the National Security Subcommittee, and then Congressman William Keating is the chair of a Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. I'm wondering, Peter, if you can just briefly talk about sort of what that means in terms of those chairmanships and the likelihood that those folks will retain their chairmanships next session.
Yeah, so those chairmanships are actually some very powerful chairmanships. Chairman of the Rules Committee, the Rules Committee of the House pretty much determines everything that's going to go on the House floor and determines how many amendments will be allowed. So it's an incredibly powerful position. Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, traditionally Ways and Means had been the most powerful committee, is one of the most powerful committees. And so that having a member of Congress from your state that has that chairmanship is huge in terms of being able to focus on the state when passing policies. Tax policy is one of the biggest things that they do. I believe they will, and Mr. Keating, chair of Foreign Affairs, I believe they will all retain their chairmanships. I don't think that Democrats have a term limit like Republicans do in the House. And so unless somebody were to challenge them, which is pretty unlikely, they will retain those.
Great, thank you. Okay, so then taking a look at our state election results. So in terms of the Mass Senate, we now have 36 Democrats and 3 Republicans elected to serve in the Massachusetts Senate. The 2 new members will be Senator-elect John Cronin and then Senator-elect Adam Gomez. Matt, any items of note related to the MA Senate?
Sure. Actually, we're actually it's 37 Democrats. We actually the Cronin seat was a Democrat challenging an incumbent Senator Dean Tran, who was knocked off. So we're actually the Democratic supermajority actually increased. They had picked up some seats early in the year in special elections. The seat out in Western Mass for Don Humison's seat went to the Democrat John Belis, who was a House member. And on the Cape, through retirement for Senator DiMacedo, it was picked up by Sue Moran in the Plymouth seat. So the supermajority is 37-3 in the Senate. And as typically I'd say 2 of the 3 Republicans in the Senate are probably Democrats in any other state in the union. So it's a very, gives you a sense of kind of the Senate continues to be very, very progressive, more so than the House. And it's, it'll be, we're not anticipating at this point, we're not hearing any rumblings about any kind of leadership challenge in terms of the Senate. And we anticipate that when the new legislature is sworn in January, Senator Spilka will remain as Senate president.
Great, that's good to. Can you remind us just really quickly for those who need the quick civics lesson, what does a supermajority mean then?
So, I mean, a supermajority is, essentially these guys are, the Senate and the House are both in positions where they can override the governor's veto with 2/3. To override a veto of the governor, the legislature needs a 2/3 vote in both chambers on any item. That the veto has to start in the House, and then we have the Senate. And clearly, I'm not a math. Math is not my strong suit, but 37-3 is much higher than 2/3. So so that's essentially what it means.
Gotcha. Thank you, Matt. And then moving on to the House, there are 16 new new members of the House, and you all can see on your screen who those new members are. And I hope, Matt, that I got the numbers right in terms of 127 Democrats, yep, 29 Republicans, and 1 independent in the House.
Yep.
According to what I was looking at this morning when I last checked, the one seat that still seems to be outstanding and is undecided is the 7th Hamden,
yep,
where they haven't called it yet, but it looks like Jake Oliveira has a slight lead. Is there anything of note to mention in terms of the House?
No, other than, the one thing that can kind of continues in the House is, the turnover in the House is something that has really become more of an issue. In the past, House members would stick around for longer periods of time, and then maybe they would run for the Senate. Now, probably about 50% of the House is served for less than 5 years. And I think why that's important is that kind of institutional knowledge that one might, accrue over serving a long period of time in the legislature. There's probably a little less of that. And you also, this will be kind of more for later part of the conversation, staff aren't sticking around as long. And I think that's, part of that is just, in the past, it was the benefits of kind of a roaring full economy that people weren't willing to stick it out at a job that, didn't pay all that well and was pretty demanding. So, this is, a lot of these folks are, if you've been around the State House, a lot of these folks are fairly well known. In the course of freshmen, you've got someone like Sally Kearns, who actually used to serve in the House and then retired, and now has been reelected up in the old Ted Spiliotis seat. Meg Kilcoyne is someone who we deal with. She was a staffer for 10 years for the Public Safety Committee. The House is really, Orlando Ramos from Springfield is actually a Springfield City Councilor. So you see a lot of folks, that if you're in and around kind of local politics, a lot of folks will get their start in the House, and this class is consistent with what we've seen in the past. Jake, the 7th Hamden seat is still open, although it does look like the Democrat will take that seat. It was unfortunately for the Republican, he was called the winner, but it was I believe the clerk in Belchertown, Massachusetts, was just so bleary-eyed from counting ballots that he just transposed the numbers wrong on election night. So unfortunately for the Republican there, that didn't work out his way. But again, that in the House, we do anticipate at this point that House Speaker DeLeo, who was just reelected unopposed, will seek re-election as Speaker when the new legislature is sworn in January. Although the House, there's always more, just by nature of that, there's 160 members in the House as opposed to 40 in the Senate. There's always a little bit more palace intrigue over there. And every time the Speaker is up for election, there will be rumors that the Speaker is not going to seek re-election or is going to retire, that type of thing. So don't be surprised if you hear those also. Politics in Massachusetts, truth is typically stranger than fiction. So don't be surprised if, you never want to rule anything out, but at this point, it does look like Speaker DeLeo will continue to be Speaker, and he is, at this point, is the longest serving Speaker in Massachusetts history. So in terms of ballot questions, I think everyone saw the results there. Question 1 easily won. That was kind of what people thought was going to happen. Question 2 was a bit more of a jump ball, and it ended up being defeated. Despite the fact that the yes side spent, I think, $10 million, and the no side spent less than 5,000. As you may or not know, the governor came out the week before the election in opposition. I don't know if that had something to do with the outcome on that. The question was probably a little bit more confusing and to a lot of folks, and people's, I think, natural inclination on ballot questions, if they don't really understand them, is to vote no. And I think that's probably what happened here. Ranked choice voting, as folks probably know, is the law of the land up in Maine, and we do have it in some limited forms in some municipalities in Massachusetts, including Cambridge. it's a little different than what was being proposed on the state ballot. So. Someone's asking a question about question 2. Will it come back? If it were to come back, it would have to, likely would come back in the form of a standalone piece of legislation in the legislature. I would say that the prospects for passage would be unlikely, given that people just voted on it. I think typically the legislature would look at that and kind of take a pass on it. But I certainly think it's an issue that's going to continue to kind of be around. There was a lot of energy and enthusiasm around it.
Let's talk about what we think, if we look into our crystal balls, will happen between now and January. In January, both there'll be the presidential inauguration and the swearing in of a new Congress, as well as the swearing in of a new legislature and the start of the 192nd legislative session here in Massachusetts. So I'd like to start, Peter, in the next couple of months. I think a lot of us on the call are eager to know what might happen with a fourth stimulus bill. We also know that the appropriations, right, has sort of gone into continuance a couple of times, and that holds what the allocation would be for the NEA, the NEH, and the IMLS. And with a, potentially very close Senate control, or, a close House Senate, a close Democratic and Republican tie in the Senate, control of the House still for the Dems, and then the White House, but that not happening until January. What do you think what we can expect will happen in the next 3 months?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I knew I would win a lot of money on the lottery. But yeah, right now it's still pretty much crazy and up in the air, unfortunately. So as you mentioned, government funding is currently in a continuing resolution. FY 2021 started on October 1st. They were not able to pass this appropriations bills, and so a continuing resolution until December 11th is currently what the federal government is operating under. So that will have to be addressed. In terms of that, the House passed out of committee all 12 of their appropriations bills and passed 10 of the bills on the House floor. Until about an hour ago, the Senate had not released any of their bills, but they just released their 12 bills. And from what I've read, just briefly, there was actually pretty good bipartisan agreement on most of those bills. There's some different points of contentions with Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, but those 12 bills are out. So currently, those will have to be conferenced with the House bills in order to come to an agreement. And the talk is that both Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in the Senate and Speaker Pelosi in the House have said they want to pass an omnibus bill, and that just means passing all of those bills together. And with the timing so late, and with potentially trying to also pass the COVID-19 relief bill, that's really the only option that makes sense at this point. In terms of funding for the NEA, NEH, MLS, the House passed a $7.75 million increase for the NEA and the NEH to $170 million, which was the ask for Arts Advocacy Day, if any of you guys attended that earlier this year virtually. And the Senate just released their interior bill, and they actually level funded the NEA and NEH at $162.25 million. So we're hoping that they'll come somewhere in the middle, so there is at least some sort of increase. We'd love them to come to the House number, but they usually sort of split the difference if there's something like that. So we'll continue to work with our colleagues down here in our coalitions to try and see if we can get that number closer to the 170 number. So that's appropriations. In terms of COVID-19 relief, I'm sure you saw all the drama over the summer. The House passed 2 bills, the HEROES Act, and then a skinny version of that bill. The Senate had what they call the HEALS Act, which was about a $500 billion bill that didn't pass a procedural vote in the Senate For the House bills, the first bill was about $3.4 trillion worth of stimulus. The second skinny package was about $2.2 trillion worth of stimulus. And just to put that in perspective, the funding for FY 2020, the fiscal year we just ended, was around $1.7 trillion. So this is a ton of money. And again, as you guys all know, this is very necessary throughout the country. But those are where the sticking points are between Dems and Republicans. And so Majority Leader McConnell has said he wants to pass a targeted COVID-19 relief bill, which everybody takes to mean smaller. So we'll see that whether they can come to agreement on a top line number. There are some issues around liability protections that the majority leader really wanted. There's some testing language that are sort of a red line for Democrats, testing and tracing language. So that all has to come together, and that can either be a separate bill, or they could wrap that into an omnibus bill and just have their members take one vote and sort of clear the decks. The only other wild card is, as we talked about, the president has not conceded yet, and if and when the election is certified for President-elect Biden, nobody's really sure if the president will be willing to help legislate on this, will be willing to sign into law these appropriations bills. So that's just another wild card that's out there that you sort of have to take into account. Like if there is language in one of the Milcon VA appropriations bills that says that all the bases with Confederate generals' names have to be changed, is that going to be a sticking point for the president and have him veto it? So that's just something to keep in mind as we sort of look at this 3-month process. But ideally, they're going to pass some sort of COVID-19 relief bill and an omnibus package for appropriations, and that would clear the decks for the next administration when they're sworn in on January 20th.
And one of the things that, Peter, you and I and other state arts advocacy captains have talked a lot about is how when the House's last stimulus bill actually included language from the Save Our Stages Act, as well as I think it's called the CREATE Act, which is the other sort of like arts and culture specific relief bills that we've been advocating for. Do you have any reason to believe that that will be included in the next version of this fourth stimulus bill? Is that being talked about?
Yeah, so as Emily mentioned, sorry, I forgot to mention it, the version of the Save Our Stages Act was included in the Skinny Heroes bill. There was actually also a bill, a small business recovery relief bill that Senate Democrats released a couple weeks ago. It was only Senate Dems, so it wasn't going anywhere, but that also included a version of the Save Our Stages Act. It's something that we've been talking to legislators on Capitol Hill about. They know it's something that, while it doesn't plug all of the holes for arts and culture sector, it is definitely something that would be helpful. And so we're hoping that a version of it gets included, and we're currently working with our colleagues and some other coalitions on sort of finalizing language, because there are a couple different versions floating around out there. So we're trying to make sure that the language is very inclusive for nonprofits. And so I personally don't think that it will get included, but we're going to try our best to get it included. And it just all really depends on the size of the relief bill, right? So if it's closer to a $2 trillion bill, there's a much higher chance that something like this gets put in. If it's a much smaller $500, $600 billion bill, there's very little chance that it gets included.
Thanks, Peter. And I guess the same would go in terms of state and local aid, right? Like that's a big thing that we've been talking a lot about in our conversations as well.
Yeah, so that's one of the big, that was one of the big sticking points with this fourth package. And in terms of that, Majority Leader McConnell has said some more encouraging things about needing to put some money in there for state and local governments. Dems have wanted to, I mean, their first bill, they had almost $1 trillion for state and local. So Democrats see the need there. A lot of Republicans, especially on the Senate side, have said, we see all this money that we've given from the initial CARES Act and it hasn't been spent yet. So we want to see states spend that rather than appropriate more money. So again, that the CARES Act funding needs to be spent by the end of December. So a lot of that money has been going at the door much more recently. But I think both sides see the need for getting money to state and locals, and there will be state and local money in there. It just depends on what the amount is. And I think for Democrats, if they don't get the amount that they want in this bill for state and local and some of their other priorities, I think their hope would be to pass a big stimulus bill early on in a President Biden administration, much like President Obama had to do with the Recovery Act.
Right. Thanks, Peter. So then turning our attention to the state. So Matt, we are in the midst of the fiscal year 21 budget process. The House is debating their version right now, and Chair Rodrick's on the Senate side announced that he's going to release, or excuse me, the Senate Ways and Means is supposed to release their version on Thursday, with debate starting next week. In terms of all the work that needs to get done before the end of the session on December 31st, so what can you tell us from your crystal ball?
Sure. So and Peter really kind of laid it all out with kind of, what's been going on the federal level and how it impacts us on the state level. Where we were, at one point within the last couple of weeks, we had, the legislature was working on 3 different budgets for 3 different fiscal years. And for FY20, which hadn't been closed out yet, FY21, which is being debated this week in the House, and the work on the FY22 budget, which will really start in January. So, what has happened in the last couple of weeks is that the legislature has done a closeout supplemental budget for FY20, which is now sitting on the governor's desk as of Friday evening. It was essentially kind of a pre-conference bill, meaning that the House and Senate leadership kind of pre-negotiated what would go into it and really kind of limited amendments that were accepted on the floor. For example, in the House, I think there were 39 amendments filed, and all but 3 were either rejected or withdrawn. The Senate actually did the bill in an informal session, meaning it was moved by unanimous consent, and it didn't even require a roll call vote. So there was really kind of no opposition, and the goal was really to kind of get it on the governor's desk. We are now looking at the FY21 budget, which Emily has correctly pointed out, the House begins debate on it. They started supposedly at 10:30 this morning. They are, what the state has done is that they have been passing what they call 112 budgets, because our fiscal year starts on July 1st. So we are one of a handful of states that does not have a full fiscal year budget in place. And what we've been doing is passing these kind of monthly budgets that essentially kind of keep state government functioning. As quite frankly, as the legislature has been waiting on action on the federal level, as you can well imagine, folks did not want to make draconian budget cuts if they didn't have to, both from a kind of a political standpoint, it's not good politics, but also from a real world reality. It's disruptive to folks that are requiring that are dependent on those services. So they now haven't, they've now introduced this, is a spending vehicle for the rest of the fiscal year for FY21, which shows so essentially for kind of 8 months. And how they're doing it is, they're tapping into, the state has a fairly robust rainy day fund of about $3.5 billion. So they're kind of tapping into that. They're doing some kind of one-time spending, so one-time kind of budgetary, I don't say they're gimmicks, but they're one-time kind of budget mechanisms where they can pick up some quick money. You're seeing that with kind of sales tax collection, kind of moving from quarterly to end of month, which will pumping about $300 million into the FY21 budget. So, what they are waiting on for, I think in general, the budget is, the goal is the House is doing it this week. The Senate's going to release their budget on Thursday. So we're going to be in the situation where the House isn't going to be done debating their budget before the Senate introduces the budget, which is very unusual. I've never seen it done before. And then it'll be conferenced, and the goal is to have it on the governor's desk by the end of November. And again, the timeline typically for conferencing, reconciling a typical budget is, typically 4 weeks, 6 weeks. So for them to kind of do this at this pace is something we've never seen before. Why they're doing it right now is quite frankly, the legislature, has amended their operating rules for this period of time, for the first time, quite frankly, since 1995, we're going to have a real lame duck session. The legislature, the last time they did a lame duck session, they determined that lame duck sessions really weren't a good idea. They changed their operating rules. And they haven't had one since 1995. So, I started working in the building in 1996 in the House. So I have never seen a lame duck session. So it's really going to be interesting. If I had to predict what they're going to do is I think the focus is obviously going to be on the budget, and then they will turn to a number of items that they have in conference committee that were passed before or on the July 31st typical end of session. And those involve, there's 5 major conference committee reports that are pending. One deals with police reform, one deals with healthcare, one deal is a transportation bond bill, meaning capital spending on transportation projects in the state. One is another bond bill dealing with economic development, which is probably of interest to folks here. And the final one is on climate change. If I had to predict what's going to happen, I think that the majority of the 4 or 5, if not all 5 of these, will get done between today and when they wrap up session, which will be on January 5th of 2021. In a quirk of our legislature, based on the state constitution, the new legislature, this legislature, meaning the 2019-2020 legislature, will actually still be impaneled until that date in 2021. So a new legislature will be sworn in on January 6, 2021. And if passed is any guide, this legislature will stay in session until the evening of sometime the evening of January 5th before they go sine die and close out the session. And then the new legislature is sworn in about 12 hours later. And then we kind of go into the 21-22 session, which it's obviously too early to predict what, if any, changes there'll be to the rules, or if they stick to the kind of traditional 18-month formal session process. But that's big picture. It's going to be a lot of budget, and we will be waiting on with what the feds do, in particular as it pertains to state and local funding. It will really kind of be a determining factor of kind of what FY22 looks like. I think that's the budget that folks are really kind of nervous about, because I do think that we are to kind of make this budget, the FY21 budget, less painful. They are tapping into that rainy day fund to the tune of about $2 billion, which doesn't, essentially the rainy day fund is essentially your emergency savings account that you might have. And it's while it's not all the money, it's a lot of the money, and it leaves you with a lot fewer options, in particular because folks, and it's kind of getting in the weeds a little bit, but of the state budget, about 50% or more of the budget is non-discretionary, meaning that the legislature has to fund those accounts, and a lot of those deal with health and human services, which is half our state budget. And so it's really so the actual delta is a lot smaller. When you see $46 billion in a state like Massachusetts, that's a lot of money. But when you really start to factor in the money that they can't touch, and that the fact that this budget does not include any revenue increases, it goes pretty quick. I will say that I do think that revenue, kind of like a revenue package, will be on the table for FY in January. The governor had come out pretty strongly with regards to FY21, saying he would not support any revenue increases, which is a signal to House leadership that if they're going to include revenue in their budget, it has to pass by a veto-proof majority, because the governor is going to veto everything. So, but I think that's, I think that's, put a pin in that one for now, because I think it'll come up in the next, starting in January.
So thank you, Matt. That is great. So just for folks, as we've been talking about all along on our policy and action updates, and what happened last week is that in the House, so in terms of fiscal year 21 budget, Governor Baker allocated $16.3 million to the Mass Cultural Council, which would be a cut from last year, from fiscal year 20's Mass Cultural Council budget. The House came out, the House Ways and Means proposal was at 18.1, which is level funding for the Mass Cultural Council. And Matt and I had this conversation. We've had this conversation with leadership over at the Mass Cultural Council, as well as the chair of the Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development Committee in the legislature, that is actually great news, considering how far they had to dip into the rainy day fund, that they are committed to level funding on the House side. We'll obviously see what's going to happen with the Senate in terms of the Mass Cultural Council budget. And then again, remember, that's sort of the largest that's the largest vehicle for public investment in the creative sector. The other thing I just want to footnote that Matt talked about is that economic development bond bill. That's something that we all worked really hard on over the summer to ensure that there was authorized spending for relief for the creative sector. So the House and the Senate both included authorized spending for the cultural community, and specifically as well for artists, as well as arts education and connections to young people to cultural institutions and cultural activities. All told, between the two houses and the two versions of the economic development bond bill, there's $31 million in authorized spending for the cultural community. And then there's also a provision to create a commission to study the impact of COVID-19 on the creative community and make recommendations, which is a really good thing. We already saw how when that commission was put together for the restaurant industry, very quickly after that, a number of provisions were put out to allow restaurants to do like the to-go cocktails, or including more outdoor seating for longer. So that's just a recap on where we are. So let's move ourselves to the even more vague. So what do we expect will happen after the swearing in, and the new president is sworn in, the new Congress is sworn in, and then the new legislature is sworn in Massachusetts? So Peter, I know that the Americans for the Arts has worked really diligently to put together a policy proposal called Getting Creative Workers Back to Work. And that was sent to both the Biden-Harris administration, or excuse me, Biden-Harris campaign, as well as the Trump-Pence campaign. Do you have any sense of how the Biden-Harris transition team is thinking about the creative community when they are thinking about their transition and recovery plans? Seeing as how they put up the website 2 days ago.
Yeah, so they've been sort of very tight-lipped on a lot of the transition stuff, which is understandable, but I think they're trying to staff up. And one sort of caveat I'll throw out there, a little bit of inside baseball, but basically once the GSA is a nonpartisan agency down here, and they are supposed to help with the transition, but there is a Trump appointee that's the head of the GSA that has not yet submitted a letter saying that Biden is the president-elect. And so until that happens, they cannot formally start working with agencies and stuff. And the transition is such a short period, you want to do it as quickly as possible, because it's like 71 days at this point or something like that. But you're talking about 4,000 employees leaving their offices and getting in like another 4,000 employees for a lot of those political appointed positions in the various agencies in the White House. And so that needs to happen as soon as possible in order for them to start like staffing up and focusing on these types of things. I put into the chat, this was included in the democratic platform. Americans for the Arts and the Arts Action Fund tried to work with both the DNC and the RNC in terms of getting arts in the platform. The RNC didn't actually formally have a platform. The DNC we were able to work with. Representative Barbara Lee was a huge help in getting this arts plank into that platform. And so in terms of working with the transition and the next administration, if we look at what happened under 4 years of the President Trump's administration, they tried to zero out the NEA and the NEH all 4 years. Obviously, great news for us. There's bipartisan pushback in Congress, and funding has increased every single year, which has been great. But we have put together a proposal putting creative workers to work again, and that link is in there. It's about 16 points, which I can sort of sum up in 6 main points that we are working around. It's creating a President's Office of Arts and Culture and Creative Economy, directing federal employment and commissioning of creatives, incentivizing local, state, tribal, and private sector employment and commissioning creatives, addressing inequalities within existing federal policies, investing in and protecting K-12 undergraduate and graduate and out-of-school arts education initiatives, and supporting digital competency and access for all. So that's sort of the 6 main points of what this paper is trying to convey. So we'll be working with the transition team once they're in place to see what are ways that we can work with them to get some of these things implemented, starting hopefully at day 1. I will also say this has been something that we are working on in the congressional arena, and we're working with a member of Congress who saw this, saw our website and our statement on this and wanted to work with us on putting that into bill form. And so that's something that we are hoping to get, if it's introduced this year, would just be sort of to get it out there and get co-sponsors, but reintroduced next year, hopefully. So we're working at this on various different angles in terms of trying to make sure that with hopefully more favorable administration coming in for the arts and culture sector, that we can get our priorities front and center, and so they're not just an afterthought. And that is a really big priority of Americans for the Arts and the various cultural groups that we work with down here. And so we're all working sort of in tandem, trying to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. So once we do know who the correct people are to talk to on the transition team, we can get them these documents, get them our thoughts, and put them in touch with the right people to sort of hopefully put that in motion. But that is sort of a brief overview of what we're looking forward to starting the beginning of next year.
Awesome, thank you. And we, as Peter mentioned, the link to that full document is in the chat box. The other item that, or policy document that I think would be useful for us all to just have a reminder on and access to is the Cultural New Deal proposal, which is, which actually I think there are in a number of places overlap with the Getting Creative Workers Back to Work proposal. But those two policy papers, I think, are very helpful. And I would encourage all of you on this call to take a look. Is it still possible to endorse the Getting Creative Workers Back to Work proposal, Peter?
Yeah,
Great.
you can still endorse it. I think at this point there's over 900 national organizations and something like 11 or 1,200 individuals. So you can do it, your organization can do it, or as an individual. A lot of individuals are artists. You might recognize if you look at the Massachusetts list. So we'd love as many endorsements as possible. And this just gives us more support, showing that there are stakeholders that are invested in this when we do hopefully work with the Biden-Harris administration on some of these things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And footnote, MASSCreative was delighted to sign on and endorse that proposal when it was made available. So thank you, Peter, and for putting that, and the Americans for the Arts for putting that proposal together. So switching lenses to think about the state level. So you talked, Matt, you already talked a little bit about the interesting transition that's going to happen at the beginning of January. But, I think this is really useful, and, my nerdy government civics brain gets excited about this, is that in Massachusetts, we have a 2-year legislative session. So this will be the beginning, this will be year 1 of the 2-year session starting in January. And can you just run through what that actually means, Matt, in terms of legislation development and policy development?
Sure. Yeah, and we have Massachusetts. We're very different than a lot of other states in terms of our legislature is it's a professional legislature, meaning that there are legislators are a lot of them are full time and they have professional staff, and so they're it's kind of seen as probably one of the more sophisticated state legislatures around the country, and I think typically what happens is we operate on a kind of a 2-year cycle. And we come in January, the first Wednesday in January of the odd number year, and they remain in what we call formal session until July 31st. It's supposed to be midnight. Sometimes it's midnight. Sometimes it's 2 in the morning. Sometimes it's 5 in the morning on August 1st. But that's kind of like that date. That date is important because that is the last day of formal sessions, meaning that's the last day of kind of recorded roll call votes. And why that's important is that if you have a piece of legislation that is deemed, controversial or that is in contention, that's the last day you can, that it could be moved. And after that point, from August 1st through the remainder of typically the calendar year through the remainder of the session, the legislature continues to meet typically twice a week, what they call informal sessions, which are where any matter can be moved, with the exception of some bills that are required by the Constitution for roll call votes, such as land takings that have to be done on a roll call. They can continue to move as long as there's unanimous consent. And what that means is that as long as no member of either house or either branch of government stands up and doubts the presence of a quorum, the matter can proceed. If a member gets up, all they have to do is doubt the presence of a quorum, and the presiding officer will ascertain that a quorum is not present, and they'll gavel out for that particular session. They can come back the next day and try again, and that type of thing. And you do see that. So that what the practical impact of that is that the minority party, or or in some cases, a faction of the majority caucus, the Democratic caucus, has the ability to kind of have a disproportionate impact on legislation. So that's why you see leadership really, try and manage. One of the biggest things that leadership does is they try and manage the clock in terms of what they're going to move for legislation. And I don't see that. Again, I don't know what's going to happen next session in terms of what they're going to do for operating rules. But my sense is that they reluctantly went to this modified session again since the first time since 1995. And again, they previously had to think about that kind of perspective. Since 1995, we've had recessions, we've had the 9/11 attacks, we've had major incidences where people called for them to kind of to change the rules to allow for a session to continue, and they'd never done it until COVID. So I think that the legislature, as we all know, is a unique institution with its own kind of culture, history, and things that make sense to legislators don't necessarily make sense to anybody else, anyplace else in the world. But so I do think that if I had to guess, they'll probably try and revert back to their normal course of business. What that typically means is when the new legislature is sworn in, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. The freshman legislators are then taken and kind of put in this area, which they affectionately call the bullpen, which is essentially a large open air, kind of office where they're all kind of lumped in together until they can make determinations of, people's office space. And what that's driven by is, leadership, when they announce kind of the leadership team. And that's, typically, so the beginning of the legislative session typically is kind of hurry up and wait. They're in, there's about a proper circumstance, and then they don't do anything for a while. And what, that is the period where they will introduce legislation. They've changed the rules by which, legislators will have to introduce new bills. It'll be by the end of January. It used to be, before the end of the calendar year, but they really determined that wasn't fair to kind of incoming members. So they did change it a couple of years ago. I think it works a little better that way. And, what really happens then is everything kind of is held up until they make those kind of committee assignments, because unlike Congress, where they tend to move fairly quickly on kind of these caucus, for contested, seats in the caucus, they move fairly quickly. Here, the decision is really rooted in the Speaker and the Senate President. It's, they don't have these kind of caucus votes where they, where people, there is jockeying for position, but it's largely, inside baseball. And there will, again, it's always somewhat of a process. If there were to be a change in leadership in either branch, it makes it even a bigger deal in terms of kind of what that would look like. So, my sense is that, you have the opportunity to kind of really see what's kind of been introduced legislatively, before committee assignments are made and all that. So, from there, what ends up happening is once they make those, people kind of shuffle and they kind of move offices, that type of thing, and then they really kind of start. The first year of the legislative session is largely driven by, the budget is the biggest thing that they will do, and then it will be every bill that gets introduced in the Massachusetts legislature, and there's typically between 7,000 and 8,000 individual pieces of legislation that are introduced, is required by the Constitution to have a public hearing. So, so there is a lot of that. So the first year of the session usually is dominated by the budget and getting through the hearings, because typically the legislature in the first year will be in from January to approximately the Wednesday before the Thanksgiving holiday. And they'll get through the budget, and what they try and do is they try and get a couple things, kind of big ticket items done in either branch to kind of maybe get some stuff into conference. So when they break for Thanksgiving through the end of the calendar year, and they come back in January of 2022, that from January to July 31st is typically a sprint.
Right.
That is where the vast majority of legislating on individual pieces of legislation occurs. And to put a kind of finer point on it, the vast majority of that happens from June until July 31st. So like the last 8 weeks of formal sessions, when, hopefully folks are, their kids are out of school, they're spending time in, the Cape or Maine or wherever. People like me are stuck up in the State House, and, roaming the halls, talking to people and doing our job. So that's typically how it works. Again, how it's going to work next year is unclear at this point. But I do think we will see for the remainder of this year, I think we will see a pretty active lame duck session.
Got it.
The other thing to keep in mind is that the number of bills that get introduced, typically if a bill is introduced in Massachusetts, and even if it does not, kind of make it all the way to the governor, it will be refiled. More often than not, if you see something, either for good or for bad, there's some, bills that get introduced that are kind of perennial issues that just kind of come up, and they'll be, typically when a new piece of legislation is introduced in Massachusetts, it doesn't make it to the governor's desk the first time it's filed. More often than not, it takes multiple sessions before it makes it to the governor. There's lots of reasons for that, but that's just typically the kind of way to work. So other things we can expect is, again, obviously if they pass a big COVID package, that will be of keen interest to folks here, both from a budget perspective and then, in any number of other fronts. The other kind of wild card in this whole thing is, and Peter was really talking about transition, is if there is movement of folks from Massachusetts that are tapped to go into the Biden administration. That can lead to a lot of activity. That can lead to a lot of shenanigans. Don't forget when John Kerry was selected by President Obama to become Secretary of State, that led to a Senate race, that led to a House race, which led to Ed Markey becoming senator, led to Catherine Clark becoming Congresswoman Clark. Don't forget, Catherine Clark had been, I knew Catherine when she worked in the AG's office, and then she was a House member, and then she was a senator, and then she was a U.S. member of Congress, and now she's in line, she's in House leadership. Right. That's been in about 10 or 12 years. So that's how quickly things have happened for her. So I do think that'll have that will be a big deal too. I do think there is a lot of speculation about people from Massachusetts who could go into the Biden administration, and I'm sure that there will be some, and that we'll see how that plays out.
I will confess to you that based on the things that I'm reading, I think I might get tapped for the Biden-Harris administration, as will all of us on the call, based on the number of folks they think from Massachusetts will go. Yeah. So thank you. That is so helpful. And so just to recap in terms of if things were to go the way we think they're going to go, bills will get filed or refiled at the beginning in January, and then they'll get hearings in that first year of the legislative session, but then movement on the majority of those really won't happen until the second year of the legislative session. So just in terms of, for folks on the call that have been tracking pieces of legislation for this session, we're coming up to the end of that, and we are tracking a couple of bills. There's the Massachusetts Percent for Public Art bill that we've been tracking. It probably is very likely that we'll have to refile that bill next session if we decide that that's what we want to do, but just as a sort of footnote to that. So Peter and Matt, in terms of our congressional delegation, we don't have a lot of turnover, but we do have some folks who hold particular places of power. And then on the state legislative side, we have a ton of turnover in the House. And as you mentioned, it's not just that there are new elected officials, but their staff also turns over. And that will happen both for folks who have been newly elected, as well as folks who are continuing their run and their staff will turn over. So can you both give me or give us sort of what are your top tips for how to either build relationships with one's elected officials and their staff, as well as thinking about introducing new elected officials and new staff to our issues? And why don't I'm going to switch it up. And Matt, would you mind starting this time?
Sure. So, this is, one of the big things is in terms of, I'll show my bias here. I'm a former staffer. I worked in Congress. I worked in the House, in the Massachusetts House, the Mass Senate. The piece about kind of, the staffing piece is critical because, typically in the legislature, the way they kind of do it is a rank and file House member will have one staffer, a chair or, someone in leadership will have multiple staff. In the Senate, they're going to have, typically they're going to have, a couple folks, in particular, the further they are away from Boston, they'll have kind of a bigger district office. It's, having kind of a working relationship with the office is critically important. At the end of the day, staff are the folks that actually, they're the ones that, when you're trying to get an amendment filed on deadline, when you're trying to get a piece of legislation filed, and all those things, you're dealing with the staff. The member's going to say, sure, well, I'll do this or I'll do that. But at the end of the day, it's really the staff that really kind of, get it done. So, big picture advocacy, I always kind of remind folks, be nice to the staff. They're the ones that can make it or break it for you. And typically a lot of them are the ones that really kind of know what's going on. Especially staff that have been there for a while, because they've kind of seen it all before. The other thing why it's important to in addition to just being like kind of the right thing to do, is a lot of staff end up becoming members. You see this all the time. Like you see, chiefs of staff to senators, run for the Senate seat. You see, people who run a House member's office run for, in this particular cycle, you had, Ted Phillips, who took Lou Kafka's seat. Lou retired, member of leadership retired. Ted was his longtime staffer, and now he's going to represent the same district. Meg Kilcoyne for Hank Naughton's seat out in the Clinton area. So I mean, it's they have the advantage of kind of having seen it, kind of done all this stuff. So I think that I always kind of make the argument that some of the best members are the former staffers, because they've kind of seen it and done it. And I would say my congressman Jim McGovern's a great example of that. He's someone who started off as a staffer for Joe Moakley, and is now a congressman.
Right.
And he's probably my opinion, he's one of the better members because he kind of gets that. But obviously I'm biased because I'm a Worcester guy. In terms of getting to know the actual members, you always have to remember that most folks that kind of get into, especially in the state legislative level, they're doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it because they're active in their community. They want to help their community, and more often than not, they're good people. There are exceptions to that. There are some some folks that don't kind of fit that criteria, but that tends to kind of sort itself out for the most part. So I would encourage folks, especially if they have new members that are representing them, to reach out to them. They're gonna want to hear from you. They're gonna want to get to know your issues. They're gonna want to kind of understand more. And I as a general rule of thumb, whenever we get approached by anybody saying, hey, can I meet Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so, you would always take those meetings, because first and foremost, these guys are always terrified that someone's actually going to run against them. And they're trying to figure out this person's, trying to key up, whether they're going to run against them or not. So, I think it's not a hard thing to do. You just have to kind of take the initiative and do it. And a lot of these folks will have, especially the non-Boston members, will have district offices, and they'll have office hours in the community, that type of thing. And it's a relatively accessible way to kind of to get to know these folks if you don't already know them. And again, I would encourage you to do that, because that's the best way to really to start their relationship. The most critical thing I would tell you, though, is the best time to go and talk to these folks is when you don't need anything. The best time to go and meet these folks is when you're just trying to introduce yourself. What you don't want to be is in the position of you've never had a conversation with your state rep or your state senator, and your organization is in desperate need of something, and you have to pick up the phone and call this person, and they don't even know who you are. That sometimes it works. More often than not, it doesn't. So it's important to have that relationship.
Yeah. So Matt, that's an interesting moment, right? Because like for our sector, we are dealing with an incredible economic crisis, right? Like the prolonged shutdown due to the necessary shutdown from COVID-19 has meant that a lot of our organizations are really struggling. And so it does feel like this is the time that we need to go ask. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking of creative ways to sort of like approach that, right? Mm-hmm. Is that all of our organizations, I mean, I hear every day the stories about how individual creatives and cultural organizations are delivering services to their audiences and to their communities, oftentimes subsidizing it themselves. But there are a lot of like good news stories to share. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, I think, with the advent of having to move a lot of our work online, opportunities to connect legislators and staffers with the work that we're doing in a way that doesn't require them to take an evening off and go into a space or a gallery or such. So I think that feels like, the other thing is, and I think we may have put it in the chat box already, and this isn't good news, but this is data, which is really helpful, is that the Mass Cultural Council just released their fourth COVID economic impact survey data, which tells that we're now at almost $500 million of losses. 30,000 jobs in Massachusetts have been affected by COVID-19 shutdowns. And so that package of information is also, I think, a part of the story that we need to be sharing with our elected officials and with their staff to say, we're doing really great work and it's not happening, and we're subsidizing that work, and we want to continue to do that work for our communities. And we want to make sure you know about that.
Emily, your point is well taken. Communication is absolutely critical. I think the other thing that I would kind of highlight it, and this is something that is becoming increasingly more important, is if you had told me, I don't know, 6 years ago that that you could essentially kind of advocate or lobby via social media, I would have told you were crazy. I will tell you that social media has taken on an increasing importance for legislators than in some respects outsized importance. I mean, I think there are the Senate in particular, under former Senate President Stan Rosenberg, really took this initiative to really kind of embrace technology, and I think some folks would argue maybe they took it a little too far, but there were times where we were doing client work. We represent a coalition of we represent a group called the Coalition for Homeless Individuals, which is a group of homeless service providers. Think of say Pine Street Inn, for example. And we were getting more support from contacting members of the Senate via Twitter than you couldn't get them in the hallway to have a conversation with you, but you could get them to respond to a tweet. And it led to a successful, increase in the appropriation. And to me, it was really an eye-opening experience where, these folks are so much more connected online, especially the younger members. I'm not gonna, there are members who don't know, they don't know what Twitter is. They don't want to use it. They don't want to use they might have a Facebook page, but they're not really on social media. Maybe their staff is. But there's a lot of younger members who are, who manage their own, social media accounts. And, when you're interacting with them, you're actually interacting with them. You're not interacting with a staffer, you're interacting with the member. So I think that's another, especially in this climate where, there aren't, the State House is closed to the public. Mm-hmm. I am a lobbyist, and I have not stepped foot in the State House since March 11th. Mm-hmm. And it was, in some ways, it was, it made things harder. In some ways, it actually made things easier. But it definitely made them different. And we're not going to be in there before the end of the calendar year, and who knows when we'll be in there, next year. So it has taken, has changed the way everybody operates. And I think that, so it's something where, if you're not comfortable doing the face-to-face stuff, if your member isn't doing that type of thing, there are other ways to interact. And I think you need to tell your story, because if folks, because these guys are, and this isn't a criticism of them, but they get thrown 100 different issues in a day of people coming at them on advocating for this, that, and the other thing. If you're not kind of telling their story, you can't assume that they already know it. Right. You need to educate them, and the key is, it's not a one and done thing because of that turnover we talked about earlier. It's a constant process of re-educating members and staff, making sure that's why you typically would see, kind of January through April in particular, you would see, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, you see every, organization, you can think of doing lobby days, advocacy days in the building. And that's all about educating people. And that's absolutely critical. So, and I think that's, so I think we'll have to see how it goes next year, but, people are gonna have to think of creative ways to do that, kind of going forward.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And now to
turn our attention to our members of Congress. Peter, how should we think about connecting with our members? I think sometimes, I will confess, our work, we feel like it's like, oh, we know which bill we want to sponsor, and it feels like kind of an immediate, quick turnaround. But with the work in Congress, it feels like there's more sustained relationship building and advocacy that needs to be done. And how can we help with that work?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to piggyback on a lot of what Matthew was saying. A lot of it is similar to what you need to do. Obviously, this is a crazy time, so it's not really doable right now, but having that relationship before you need something from them. I know at the congressional level, it's great to meet the district staff, but they don't do anything with legislation. So when it comes to legislation, you want to know who the art staff is. And if you don't know who your member's art staffer is, or the senators, reach out to Emily, she can reach out to us and we can get that info to you. So that's like establishing you're in the district. Again, if you have any sorts of those stories that you were talking about or being mentioned earlier, tweeting at that member saying, oh, this is a performance that happened or whatever it is, but also making sure that their staff knows that this is happening, that you're a constituent, and having that touch point so that when you do go in and say, hey, can you co-sponsor the SOS Acts, they're much more willing to be like, hey, we've been working with Emily, we know this is a great bill, blah, blah, blah. So I think that is one of the best ways that you can do that and ensure that you keep that relationship. Just make sure you have those touch points. I know for us as a former staffer in DC, there are many times that Mr. Lynch would come back to us in the DC office and be like, hey, I ran into so-and-so on the street and this was going on, like, what can we do? So it's very much, if you get that member of Congress, if you see them in the grocery store and you introduce yourself to them and you do establish that relationship, that is another way that you could have that sort of touch point that can really, really hit home. The only other thing I would say in terms of the congressional level, for issues that we care about, like you definitely want to know your member of Congress, but also keying in on the members or on committees that matter for the arts, right? So the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee and some of the other things like that are super important to have those relationships. Shelley Pingree from Maine is the co-chair of the Arts Caucus and is on the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee and might become chair of that next year, next Congress. But even though she's not your member of Congress, right? She cares about the arts, she cares about New England, being from Maine. And so that's a really great touch point to have, just to make sure that you have the touch point for the person that's going to be writing that specific bill. So that's just sort of an overview of what you can do at the federal level. I will also throw in sort of a shameless plug for the National Arts Action Summit that we will be hosting. I think this year we'll be doing it virtually again because of everything that's going on. It'll be April 5th through 9th. And at that, there'll be sessions every day that talk about the various issue areas that we care about in the arts and gives you training on how you can advocate on those. And then the following week, April 12th through 16th, we'll be utilizing our state captains. Emily is the state captain for Massachusetts. So we'll be setting up meetings with the various members of Congress that you guys can, I assume all of these will be virtual. There might be a chance that some of them might be, you'll be able to do them in person in the district, but you'll be meeting with those members of Congress, those staffers, and talking to them about the issue areas that you learned about the previous week. So again, that's a huge thing for us in terms of just getting it on the radar in terms of a Hill Day. Like Matt was saying, like before, 2 years ago, we had almost 530 people come down to DC. We did a sort of 2-day training, and then went to the Hill and bombarded all the offices. And so that is a huge touch point for us in terms of going into the appropriation season and trying to get increased funding for the NEA, NEH, that sort of thing.
Is not a shameless plug. It's a plug that I co-endorse. And I think we will put a link in the chat box to the more information about that event. It's a really great event. And I am excited that maybe some of you who, because the cost of going to DC was too high, might be able to join us this year. I want us to, we only have a little bit of time left, so I want to open it up to questions. There have been some questions sort of all along, but I think some people have been answering them in the chat. But if there are any sort of questions that folks have, Peter, are you?
I just noticed Kara's question about the intersecting with other sectors. That is a great way of thinking about things, and that's something that we've been doing down here. We've been working with Charitable Giving Coalition, a lot of the other nonprofits that don't necessarily specifically feature the arts in terms of getting things like the Paycheck Protection Program, which is housed in small business, to make sure that nonprofits and gig economy workers, that sort of those types of people that are in our industry are eligible for those types of funds. I know several months ago, the Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives sent a letter to Capitol Hill. They had over 200 chambers, local chambers of commerce sign on, and they were discussing how cultural institutions are hugely important. So those types of partnerships, I know we've been working with their ACCE, we've been working with them to try and make sure that sort of that intersection between the arts and business is more of a factor. Because when you talk to members of Congress and initially they hear the arts and think, oh, Carnegie Hall, Lang Theater, some of these sort of bigger things that sort of elite institutions that you would think, but when you talk to them about the amount of money per capita that gets spent when somebody goes to see a performance at a restaurant, at a bar, things like that, then the creative economy, it starts to click for them. So that is a huge talking point for us, especially when we talk to Republicans on the Hill, when they're really focused on businesses and small businesses and drivers of the economy. When we can give them those statistics about their districts and states, then it sort of, oh, aha, this isn't just sort of throwing money to an elite institution that nobody's going to visit, right, in my district, that sort of thing.
So that education piece of helping folks understand the breadth and depth and diversity of our sector is also key in all of our work too. Other questions? G, are there a couple that we should lift up?
Linda has a quick question about, is there a directory of legislative staff that's contact information that's accessible?
I don't have, I have one that we pay for. I think that there is, my experience has been, this was when I was a constituent too, is that if I, call up or reach out and say, I'd love to get a meeting, oftentimes I will be, a scheduler will be the person who writes back to me, and then I will be directed to the staffer who is focused on arts policy. And that's how I discover who those staffers are. So making first contact and then being directed to those folks is the way I've done it. And then frankly, I have a Excel spreadsheet where I just sort of keep notes on that. Peter or Matt, other thoughts?
At least for the federal level, there's nothing public. There's no public document where it's all out there, but that's something that we pay for a service that has all those listed. So if you do want your federal staffers, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat box, or you can reach out to Emily and she can get to me and we can get you that information.
Yeah, same on the state level. It's something that there's a service we pay for that keeps those updated. It's a little more, I think it's a little more manageable on the federal and the state level just because it's smaller. So we tend to know, kind of who they are, but there's no like clearinghouse of the information for the public.
For those on the call, if there is a specific member that you are trying to reach out to and want more information about their staff, do reach out to Peter or I, and we will, both on the federal and the state, and we will work to get you that information. Let me see, I'm just looking. Okay, I'm seeing Erica's question, which is, now that the election is passed, do we think there's might be more of a chance to get the more visibility with the governor's office to get more flexibility with planning for arts and culture on par with neighboring states? Thoughts? Matt?
Sure. I mean, so, you know, we've been, you know, regularly engaged with folks in the governor's office, in particular that kind of, March through May timeframe. We'd be talking to them, sometimes several times a day. Now that we've kind of, we are kind of, reopening is happening. I think it's important to kind of continue the conversations, directly with the kind of, with Secretary Keneally, with the Lieutenant Governor, with the folks who are kind of been tasked by the administration, with reopening. I do think that this, the Governor Baker has, for good or for bad, has kind of taken this approach. While he certainly is, looking at what neighboring states are doing, he hasn't been afraid to kind of do his own thing, and I don't see that changing. I mean, the guy is, he's got an 89% approval rating amongst Democrats in his handling of COVID. So I think he's got the political capital. And I know it's frustrating for folks here because obviously, we're looking at, phase 3, part 2 or phase 4 as really kind of being, impacting some folks. And it's been, it can't imagine how frustrating it is for folks here. But I don't see that necessarily changing. I do think you do need to continue to kind of engage, and I do think that, listen, the news of not just the news about Emily's birthday on Saturday and the election results, but the news out of Pfizer yesterday is encouraging. And I think that, obviously it's gonna take some time, but that's kind of the marker for stage 4, right? Is, vaccination. So I do think that that's critically, important. Obviously there's gonna be, I know it's not a silver bullet, but and it's some ways off before there's gonna be widespread vaccination. But obviously, it's good news, and I think that's something the administration is going to kind of closely monitor. I also think, candidly, I think that this administration is going to get along just fine with the Biden administration. In fact, I think that they're going to be probably better positioned in some respects, just given the strength of our delegation between Congressman Neal and Congressman McGovern and others, and Congressman Lynch and others. I think, the governor has a good working relationship with the delegation, and we're going to be, they're going to work well with the Biden administration, assuming that Governor Baker doesn't go into the Biden administration, which is, kind of linked. So.
Matt, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly. Peter has to hop off now. Peter, I just want to thank you so much for joining us, for sharing what you know and giving us a better sense of what's happening in Washington, D.C. We are very proud of our partnership with Americans for the Arts, as MASSCreative is a State Arts Action Network member, and really rely on your and Derek Rome's leadership around policy issues. So thank you so much, Peter.
Of course, thanks for having me. It was great to talk to you all. And again, I put my email in the chat if anybody has any follow-up questions. But I gotta run now. So have a good one all.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks. Bye.
And we are running out of time. So if I may, I want to thank you all for joining us today and remind you that MASSCreative has been working since 2012 on these issues, but since March has really pivoted and worked really hard to make sure that you have the information that you need to be smarter, more engaged advocates. And this session is one of those examples. And so if you are a leader of an arts and cultural organization and you haven't had a chance to renew your membership to MASSCreative, I heartily encourage you to do that today. There'll be a link in the chat box. As a reminder, membership dues to MASSCreative are always on a sliding scale. We have a suggested amount, but we recognize that we are all going through a particularly tough moment and are making difficult decisions. And then if you're an individual on this call and a past supporter of MASSCreative, I am so thankful for that support. It is those donations that keep us going day in and day out. And we are right now in the middle of a fall annual fundraiser. We're trying to raise $5,000 by the end of the calendar year. We are at about 20%. So we have a ways to go, but if you feel so inclined, we'll put a link in there too. And if you will join us in that effort, that would be great. I want to thank Matt particularly for all of your insights today, your honesty, your practicality in approach to this work. I think that's what we're really looking for here in our work. And you know, Matt, you work quite closely with MASSCreative, and we are so thankful for you and Lindsay and the O'Neill and Associates team. So thank you so much. If there are additional questions that folks have, G, would you add my email to the chat? Everyone should feel free to email me. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can, and will act as the Lily Tomlin phone operator to connect with Matt and to connect with Peter to get your question answered. But we continue to do this work all in partnership, and I want to thank you all. And again, thank you, Matt, for your time.
Thank you very much.
All right, have a good day, all.